Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about video game addiction. This subject matter is a little more serious than things that we have covered in the past, so I perfectly understand if you don't want to watch a video on this. That being the case, I also did write an article, and if you have further questions or want to learn about this subject matter, please go ahead and check it out. The link will be provided below. Yeah, so video game addiction is a topic that I have wanted to talk about for quite some time. Previously, I have indulged in the overconsumption of video games. I don't know if I would characterize myself as a video game addict, but I do know that in the past, my relationship with video games was not always healthy, and there was a level of dependence there that was most certainly alarming. And before we really talk about video game addiction as a whole, I think it's important that we understand addiction in itself. I have experienced the horrors of addiction through friends and family, as I've seen numerous people struggle with addiction regardless of the vehicle. And what that means is, regardless of alcohol, drugs, food, addiction in itself is a dangerous thing. That being the case, when it came time to do some research and look at some web publications on video game addiction, I was expecting to see the subject matter covered with a level of professionalism and sincerity that it's deserved. Unfortunately, I was sadly mistaken. Currently, this topic is being diluted by two dissecting dichotomies that are ultimately taking us away from making any real headway on this subject. And what that means is there are two different dispositions going on right now. One of them is a level of indifference in which people believe that video games are just games and they can't pose a real threat. There's nothing dangerous about video games. And the other one is the idea that video game addiction stems purely on the fault of video games. It's not conducive of any normal reasonings for a regular sense of addiction. And both of these ideas and both of these dispositions are honestly far too extreme and, in my honest opinion, when it comes to personal addiction, completely irrelevant. As I previously stated in this video, before we can really truly gain an understanding of video game addiction, we kind of need to understand the basics of addiction in itself. One of the largest misconceptions with addiction is that it's a definable ailment, and it simply is not the case. Addiction, regardless of the vehicle, is usually formed from a pre-existing problem. This is not always the case. Sometimes there truly are just chemical, addictions or just purely addictions to the substance, but usually addictions are formed and manifested from pre-existing problems. An example of this might be a shy, meager kid who doesn't really fit in at school and feels like he has no place of his own. So he may turn to an MMO video game, an online video game where he can feel a sense of community and he feels a sense of belonging. And this child is finding what, he does not have in the real world. And he finds that it is much easier to simply become part of this world than deal with the problems that he has in the real world. And as this child continues to get more immersed within the MMO world, his level of dependence upon this world will increase. This will ultimately lead to the point where the child will have an addiction to this game. But the addiction, what's important to understand about this, the addiction is not based on the fact that this video game exists. The addiction is based on the fact that this child is having problems fitting in within society. This is where the biggest misconception of addiction comes from. People believe that you want to just blame the thing in which the person is addicted to without really looking at the source of where this addiction came from in the first place. Now, even understanding this, it is still really difficult to deal with addiction, because if that is the case and people are turning to this, people are turning to video games, people are turning to food, people are turning to alcohol, they're doing it for different personal reasons. So it becomes really problematic to deal with addiction because each person has a different reason for becoming addicted. Each person has a different personal problem to deal with. For instance, if we look back at that example in which I just gave you, if we were to take video games away from this child, right, and he was to cut off his addiction, somehow overcome it, but he still had all these social anxieties and social problems, this child would not be healthy. He still would have problems and most likely would just turn to another outlet to to look for that sense of escape, to look for that sense of security that he's not feeling in the real world. So video games alone can't be the problem, and taking them away can't be the solution. We have to look at the impetus for why the kid was turning to games in the first place. Unfortunately, finding personal solutions is far more difficult than simply having universal scapegoats which we can blame these problems on. Even with understanding the dangers of addictions, many people see video game addiction as not a serious threat. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association recently voted in 2007 saying that they did not recognize video game addiction as a mental disorder. And even though video game addiction isn't treated with the same level of seriousness as other addictions, it still poses the same threats. In 2010, Alexandria Tobias shook her baby to death when the boy's crying interrupted her game of Farmville. And previous to that, in 2007, Daniel Petrick shot his parents, killing his mother after they took away his copy of Halo 3. Now, I understand that both of these examples are complete extremes, and it's not realistic to think that these will be, real outcomes of video game addiction. However, it is important to understand that this threat is real and it exists. And in my opinion, a side effect that is just as relevant and equally as dangerous is the fact that video game addiction can socially and emotionally cripple people who become dependent upon them. For instance, let's take a look back to that example which I touched upon earlier with the child who was looking to video games for that sense of community development and social interaction that he wasn't getting within the real world. Now, if this child continued down this path to be completely reliant on the video game for a sense of interaction and social connection. And please understand when I'm saying this within this context, I'm not saying people who play MMOs lose a sense of social connectivity. I'm not saying people who play MMOs are emotionally crippled. I'm saying someone who would completely be reliant on the internet for these interactions and have no real life experiences whatsoever would be damaged to this outcome, because then you would be left with someone who never had to face any real life troubles. When you're on the internet, there's this level of anonymity and this level of security that you don't get in the real world. You never really have to face any real social consequences. So we would have this child grown up, who may be 21 years old and have the intellectual capacity of a 21-year-old, but the emotional welfare of a 12-year-old. Now, after hearing the potential danger of video game addiction, I think it's easy to get the idea that video games are destructive and should not be allowed around children or people with addictive tendencies. And my answer to this would be that this is no different than allowing kids to really experience anything that's enjoyable or pleasurable or gives someone a sense of escape has the potential to be abused and addictive. But video games, just like every other addictive substance, is not inherently evil. For example, things like alcohol and food are dangerous when they're abused, but they're also extremely pleasurable when consumed appropriately. And I believe that many of the people who are listening to this or reading the article can agree that, there are times in your life when you have consumed alcohol and food and found it to be extremely pleasurable. But just because there's that potential for danger doesn't mean that we should completely exclude it. And the problem with video game addiction is that while people who talk about other addictions such as food, sex, alcohol are willing to concede that these things have their benefits, the people who talk about video game addiction are far less convinced. For example, one statement was made that World of Warcraft, the popular MMO, was the crack of video games. In fact, World of Warcraft in particular has taken more animosity and has been more directly linked to video game addiction than any other game I have seen. And I find it to be extremely troubling that people who are talking about this problem are demonizing video games, and in particular, they're demonizing MMO genre. And just because this genre became a relatively new popularity, and it does kind of help suffice that addictive behavior because there is no end to the game, it's not the thing that gave birth to this addictive behavior. And I think that's what's important to understand. Games like World of Warcraft do have the potential to fuel addictive behavior because there's no end to it and you can continue to invest your time into it. But like we saw in that previous example that I gave you guys, the addictive behavior is just a manifestation of other problems, and if this outlet wasn't here, the child would find another outlet to consume himself in, unless the problem was addressed. So to simply just put the blame on things like World of Warcraft will never help you solve an issue like this. At the risk of sounding repetitive, I'm going to say this again. Addiction is a difficult thing to deal with. It's almost impossible to construct a clear consensus on what constitutes for addiction. The most important thing to understand when it comes to addiction is that it cannot be defined by pure quantitative methods. What this means is, like, for example, you would take a look at the hours of video games that you play a week. And while I do believe that that is an important statistic, and you most certainly should take a look at it if you're trying to figure out whether or not video games are problematic within your life, you cannot simply look at the hours played and tell whether or not you are an addict. There are people out there who are video game enthusiasts who play ample amount of video games, but they still live balanced, healthy lives. And there are people who play significantly less than them, but video games are still a destructive force in their life. To truly figure out whether or not video games are problematic for you, it's going to take an honest approach. You're going to have to take a true look within yourself and understand your relationship with video games. Are you depending upon them to run away from other problems in your life? How do you feel when you play games? How do you feel when you not play games? It's difficult to do that, and it's unfortunate because I believe it's the only way to really truly find a solution. I hope this helped, guys. For more information, please go check out bipo.com. Thank you.